Thank you for that lovely welcome. And I think I'm supposed to make an announcement of some sort. Is somebody that something's happening at 1:30 that some people should be at? Anybody? Oh, okay. Well, we can do it at the end also. Well, thank you. It's really exciting to be here. And I'm a little tired from all that wild dancing last night. I have to say, in terms of optimism, I'm very pessimistic about most. When I hear conference dinner, I think of people droning on for hours and then cold food and milling out of a banquet hall, feeling tired and depleted. And instead, what a hilarious, rollicking, fun group you are. I mean, I will come back here every year if you let me. It was a stunning evening, and it was so much fun. So let me move into the talk. First, a little bit about myself. This is me, the budding librarian, a few years ago. And this is where I live. I live in San Francisco, and I commute every day to Oakland. My university is in a beautiful area called the Oakland Hills, and it's got a stunning view of the Bay Area. It's this adorable little cupcake of a campus, just like you have a little cupcake of a country. It's just very sweet and very small. Compact. Someone said small but perfectly formed. One of the things to know about me is I have a librarian's career. I've been working in libraries off and on since 1973, where I started my career by lettering book spines as a summer job as a teenager for San Francisco Public. It was very exciting. I was allowed to pick which color ink I would choose. So it was the black ink or the white ink. And then after I was done with my job, I would walk into the library and try to see the books I had lettered. So clearly that was important to me. I also I have a writing background. I have a MFA in writing. I write literary essays on the side, or at least I did before I became a university librarian. And in fact, next month I'm giving a talk at a literary festival in San Francisco for an essay that's being published in a collection called The Cassoulet Saved Our Marriage. And mine's the lead essay, so I'm very, very touched by that. And I bring all of this up to give you a little background about myself, but because it also relates to the subject of my talk, which has to do with optimism, a very strategic, different sort of optimism. This is Joan Didion. Some of you may recognize her. She's a famous writer, journalist from the United States. And she says, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We tell ourselves stories in order to live." Narrative has a very powerful effect on us. Meredith brought this up in her opening keynote, which is the role of narrative in allowing us to be able to envision the future. And I shared with you some things, and I would imagine that in your head you had a more fully shaped picture of me afterwards. And in the same way, when we tell stories about ourselves, about our libraries, positive or negative, it gives us a way of seeing the future, seeing as we are now, in a way that's not possible without that narrative framework. I believe in the power of story, and that goes in both directions. So a little bit about my preparation for this talk. I think it's useful. When I said I was coming to New Zealand, there would be a pause and people would say, "Do you like lamb?" Actually, I do like lamb. A lot of Americans don't. I eat it almost every week, in fact. I often have grilled lamb chops, or I make Indian kofti and a nice sauce. I would eat lamb just about any way. But I realized that I needed to do a little research because, in fact, all I could think of when I thought of New Zealand was lamb. And I knew there had to be more to it. And in fact, as I learned, there was lamington. Thank you for the Lamingtons. They were marvelous. It was great to be able to report back. They went on Facebook within minutes of my seeing them. And part of the value of travel is, you research in advance and you hear about, have you tried a Lamington? Little did I know how important licorice all sorts would be And as it turns out, you might not know this about me. I don't think I've ever blogged about it. But I also, not like a lot of Americans, I love licorice passionately. And the part of the fun, I've lived overseas. I've lived in a number of countries, England, Germany, and Korea. As many other countries appreciate licorice a lot more than Americans do. So I bow to your recognition of the superiority of licorice. And it's the value of travel is seeing a country from the inside out. It's like the value of writing is seeing a book from the inside out. And by the way, if I could do a small sidebar, I know that there's talk about giving up the book as a brand. There's almost sometimes a little bit of shame involved. Those dowdy old books, let's go off and emphasize being a community center and this and that. I would really encourage you to think of the book and. The book is a wonderful metonym for what we do as librarians. We may do all these other things, our gaming rooms, our events, our community centers, that wonderful space I saw for teens yesterday at Palmerston North. But the book is one of the most elemental things that we do as librarians. It's a form of sharing cultural memory, sharing our creativity, sharing our spirit. So I encourage you to at least keep your hand on one hand on the book, another hand on our future. So I did some research. I did a little film studies with about New Zealand. So I saw what is called overseas Samoan wedding, and that was everything I know about New Zealand comes from that movie, pretty much. And since I'm a fan of evolutionary science, and I was delighted to find out the interesting and colorful ways that your species have adapted to life in this isolated country, producing colorful but interesting birds of many species. And I am making plans after this to go visit a city. I come from San Francisco, which is a windy peninsula city with hills and a cable car. So, of course, I'm going to visit a windy, hilly city with cable car and a beautiful garden. And I did a lot of reading. And some of the things I read Michael King's wonderful History of New Zealand. That is a tremendous book. And again, if you talk about the power of books, that was a book that changed how I saw the world. Especially, I had not really thought about Polynesian migration or really how people came to New Zealand. It just had not occurred to me. I also read some leadership books that I'd been meaning to get to, and I used as an experience to stimulate the ideas that I was trying to explore. And in particular, I read a book that ended up being the inspiration for this talk called Learned Optimism. And it's by Martin Seligman. And I recognized in this book practices that I had undertaken that I didn't realize were actually grounded in evidence-driven theory about the practice of optimism, the strategic, intentional practice of optimism. But when I read it, I thought, first of all, I began adopting some of the practices in the book and recognizing the ones I had already adopted. And then the next thing I did was begin studying optimism itself. And optimism is an interesting word because sometimes people think optimism, they think really a form of optimism I'll call blind optimism or wishful thinking. If you look at the core root of optimism, it actually doesn't mean any of those things. It comes from a word from the French that means the best thing. What an interesting thing to reflect on is that what optimism actually means. It means it's the best thing. It's a road, it's a path that you follow. And of course, we know that optimism as a phrase, as a term, has evolved into an idea, a positive outlook, but it's worth keeping its roots in mind. I looked up the definition of the word in various dictionaries, and what did I see? I saw words such as future, hope, outlook, and belief. These are all words that are significant to the practice of optimism. And there's a very interesting discussion of optimism. Some of you have probably read Jim Collins' Good to Great. And there's a discussion about what is called the Stockdale paradox. And the Stockdale paradox, this is James Stockdale, who was shot down in the Vietnam War and spent 7 years in what they called the Hanoi Hilton, which was a prisoner of war camp. And he talks about, he told Jim Collins that the optimists, or what he called the optimists, were the ones who died quickly because they looked for, they looked to be released by Christmas, and Christmas came, and they weren't released. They looked to be released by Easter, and Easter came, and they weren't released. And they died of a broken heart, basically, in prison because they really had lost faith. I would actually disagree with both Jim Collins and the general that is actually optimism. I would say that is a type of optimism. I'd say it's wishful thinking. But actual strategic optimism is much more informed and much more evidence-driven, and it is a practice and a discipline. In fact, in studying New Zealand, I found that there's a great example of optimism in the founding of New Zealand. And this is a recreation of a Polynesian voyaging canoe, such as is believed to have been used in the Polynesian exploration that discovered New Zealand. And I know that there were historical arguments made that the Polynesians merely got in a canoe and drifted to New Zealand. But actually, now they believe that there was intentional guidance of these vessels towards lands that they believed, based on the best information that they had, actually existed from people who returned and said, this land exists. And in fact, I have to believe, knowing what I know of people, the whole aimless drifting thing, I hope I'm not getting too political, it seems so silly to me. Can you imagine, someone coming into his house and saying, hi, honey, I'm home. Oh, you're home 2 months early. How do you account for that? Aimless drifting. I just don't think that happened. I think people don't get into a boat and aimlessly drift off to somewhere else. They very intentionally, using the skills and the tools that they have and the experience that they have, make these plans. So, moving forward to Holy Names. This is Holy Names University, and I mentioned that it has a beautiful view of the bay. It was founded in 1868 by 6 women, 6 nuns from Quebec, who came to California by boat along the Pacific to found a school for girls and women. It became a college, then a university. The nuns eventually began wearing street clothes. They had been in a convent on the school, began living out in the community. And as so often happens, there's very few nuns left on campus, but they've transmitted their values to Holy Names. And it's important to know for this talk that in the late 1990s, Holy Names University ran into serious financial problems and almost closed. So the period after 1998 was one of slow financial recovery. Some very tough things had to happen. Some things were cut. The budgets were tight, tenure was dropped, departments were reduced. They stopped doing some things. I'm just looking because that monitor keeps blinking at me. I wonder if it's telling me to go on or something. Those were tough times. And that, by the way, is the library, perfectly centered on campus. It's a fantastic location for a library to be. In fact, we have a neon open sign so when the students are in their dorms, they can see whether the library is open or closed at their request. So this is how the library looked in 1958, 1960. And this is how it looked in 2009. And if you're thinking there's not a whole lot of difference, that's true. I was talking to someone over coffee this morning, and she said, I went to see a library, and it really hadn't changed in a long time. I said, I know that story. And in fact, I will say that at the moment, it doesn't look a lot different. And in fact, that's the original paint job, the original asbestos ceiling, the original asbestos tile. I think the entire library is more or less constructed of asbestos. And I was in Florida, and we as a family had decided we wanted to move back to California. And I saw this job ad for this tiny university. And I'd been a director before of a library for the Environmental Protection Agency and of a rural public library. And I'd been an assistant director several times. And I said, and I'd been in other executive positions. I happened to be in California the next month for actually a literary salon that I was presenting at. I said, well, I'll see if they want to give me an interview. Right? All they can say is no, right? So I interviewed, and I was so taken by what I heard and saw, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that I decided that despite what I was seeing in the library itself, that I would take the job and start there. But I knew that I would have a rough road. I'm going to show you some pictures of what the library looked like the night before I started, because they put me up on campus in the former visiting chaplain's apartment, which was its own interesting story. So I spent the first 30 days actually living on campus, which gave me some opportunities to see the library at times when I might not otherwise see it. So to start with, in a university library, I know it was close to Halloween, but I was a little concerned about the construction paper pumpkin and ghosts. I'd like to also point out, this is the computer at the front desk, and that's the direction of the front door. So in other words, when you walked in the library, what you saw was somebody's back. I felt that it actually had kind of a symbolic statement to walk in and see somebody's back. And the library, which there had been some absences, some vacancies for a while. People had been ill, directors had been gone, and there'd been nobody in charge for the previous 6 months. So some things had really fallen into decay. And one of the signs of that is what I call library graffiti, which is. And notice that the sign is there twice, just in case you missed it, that you're not supposed to touch. Do not touch, the famous no word, in highlighter, in case you missed that, and askew with the Scotch tape and so forth. And then the sign is repeated underneath. And then plenty of emphasis on what you could not do in the library, no food, and directions about what to do with your paper. And then there were some rooms that were in a little bit of need of straightening up. This was the education collection. And the stairwells were kind of scary to begin with peeling posters and patchwork and so forth. And when you got downstairs, I actually worked in a juvenile detention center for a couple of years. And this actually looked like the juvenile detention center, except maybe worse. And it was dark because they had put in motion detector lights down there, so you would walk downstairs and within a minute or two you would be plunged into darkness. And so the students called it the dungeon. And that's where most of our collection was and where most of the study tables were. And I'd also like to point out that these pictures were taken when the library was open. I was wondering if I would have to point out to you what that meant, but it doesn't, does it? And then, of course, we had an enormous card catalog, which at the time when I interviewed, I thought, well, that's interesting. They haven't got rid of their card catalog, and that's because they hadn't cataloged most of their books. Yeah, you're like, what? I know. But there were some opportunities here. I didn't know you would laugh at that. No, really. Maybe I am sort of a blind optimist, huh? Pull up my notes. What I saw was a university in recovery from a near-death experience, a library that had several vacancies to fill. I was in a bad economy, which meant that even though I didn't have the hiring power of larger institutions, we could hire exceptionally good talent at our salaries, which normally we wouldn't be competitive for. I immediately clicked with my boss, the vice president for academic affairs. who was very clear with me immediately that she said she didn't know how to run a library, and she expected me to be able to do that, which was, wholesale license to do as I please. Not really. And a recent history of renovations on campus in other areas. Plus, there was an understanding in general that the library was in crisis and needed help. So I really felt like, sometimes you have to take a chance on things. And also, I noticed that my budget was small. It's a small resource-challenged institution, very tuition dependent. By the way, we've just had the greatest enrollment ever this year, and last year was the second greatest enrollment, and that's less than 1,500 students. But that's double what it was a decade ago. And I asked about the budget before I was hired, and I said, there's very little in this line item, and there's too much in that line item. Can I move it around? No, you can't move it around. I said, well, can I underspend and overspend? And they said, absolutely, as long as you stay within the total. And I'm quite serious when people ask me, well, how did you do X? I said, the print serials budget. I just dropped most of our journals. Print journals, people weren't using them, so why not? We have 22,000 electronic journals. We had only 300 print journals, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But anyway, I knew that pretty much this is what I was walking into. And when you go into a situation like that, the initial sensation is very heady. At least it was for me. Is here's a great opportunity, but day in, day out, the reason that you have to be so intentional with optimism is that the actual reality of living with any situation that's difficult is that you get up in the morning and go into a place where there are serious systemic problems, and it's hard. It can be very hard. And when a library isn't being used, and for very good reasons, quite frankly, you've got an even higher bar to reach. And there were times when I would go home and think, really, is this really doable? But that was a thought for the evening, and I'll get into that in a moment later. But what I looked at, I said, there's some opportunities here for renewal. Libraries are in such a place. They're in such a place of change, dramatic change, and we can do things here that they can't do at Stanford or Harvard. It's very hard to move, to turn a barge. It's very hard to lift that 800-pound gorilla. But a university library that at its peak will have 5 regular employees and a dozen student workers? No, actually not. But I started out, and again, had I learned optimism in advance, I might have known to do this, but I just did it because I had a great mentor in my career, Josephine Parachi in upstate New York, who was a terrific library director. And one of the things I admired about her is she went to the ballot box 4 times to get the library she wanted. The first 3 times she didn't make it, sometimes losing by just a couple of heartbreaking votes. That 4th time she went to the ballot again. She got up, dusted herself off, figured out a new strategy, and built a beautiful library in upstate New York that's really the gem of that area and is a source of huge civic pride. And she would come into the library every day smiling and leave smiling. And I said, you know what? The first thing I'm going to do is, no matter how bad things are at work, once I pass through the gates of the university, I would show up with a smile and stay positive all day. And that's actually why I don't buy those license plate frames that say Holy Names University, because I give myself license to not be that way before I arrive at work. So as I'm driving across the Bay Bridge, I'm, swearing and cutting people off, and I wouldn't want to be identified, with Holy Names University so closely, and hide the sweatshirt and so forth. But that was the first thing I said, and I actually found that it first of all had a huge influence on the people I interacted with. It is a smile engenders a smile, but I was also the biggest praise I got was a year later, was someone said very dismissively, "You're so Pollyanna-ish," and I thought, well, that's good. That's good, because I know a lot about Pollyanna, and you'll hear about her in a little bit, too. If you've actually read Pollyanna, you'd know that's a good thing. So I decided, what could we do And I should add, in the interview process, I was actually told by several people, "We're small and poor." Then later on, they commented how hard it was to hire people, and I thought, you know, if you keep telling people you're small and poor, you might be driving them away. But that was a narrative that the institution had. We can't do things because we're poor. We can't do things because we're small. We have this sad history, you know, this, that, and the other. So, and I didn't, by the time I got there, for various reasons, my book budget had been basically spent. My database budget had been spent for the year. Things were set into motion. There were things that I couldn't change for that year. And I didn't have the staff that I needed and so forth. And I knew there were all kinds of customer service issues because I mentioned I was staying there. In my first weekend, I walked into the library, walked up to a student worker, and I was probably this far from her, and she had a cell phone, and she was sitting at the desk, and she just kept texting. And I, hello? Just kept texting. I said, okay, all right, so I see an issue here. So what I decided was, this is from an essay by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. And if you've read Good to Great, you've seen this before, but it's the difference between the fox and the hedgehog. The fox knows many little things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. So I decided to look for that one thing we could really be good at very quickly. What was the one thing we could do, I thought? And the one thing we could do that was also in line with the values of holy names, with the sisters' emphasis on charism, with our tradition of focus on women and children first, and on taking care of others, and the many Jesuitical practices, was I could decide to emphasize what is called in Catholicism radical hospitality. I made a commitment that, I do love this image from children's literature, Lonesome and Sorry. I made a commitment that we would commit ourselves to being as hospitable as we could be in all aspects of our services. And I started, and I know that some people will find this a very boring way to start, by writing a policy on internal and external communications. And I also took down all the no signs. We didn't need them. They weren't having any influence. A sign that says no has never had any impact on anyone, including me. And it was very off-putting and not getting us the results. And I made a decision that we would, for example, teach our student workers to smile and greet people as they came in. They needed a lot more skills training. They were way behind in what they understood about providing library services, but they could at least make people feel welcome when they walked in the door. And that commitment to radical hospitality was actually picked up by the incoming university president and cited in his inaugural address, which was a big deal for us. And part of radical hospitality and part of my commitment to strategic optimism was that I wasn't going to do anything that we couldn't do well. I actually, at that point, stopped a couple of services. And one of the services I stopped because we weren't doing it well was information literacy. Now, there were a lot of things that we weren't doing at all, and that includes interlibrary loan that I offered. And I learned something very important about holy names, which is they really meant it. They really thought that we were inventing these services, that we had come up with the idea that you could borrow books from other institutions. And I admit that I didn't work hard to dissuade them from that. But it was really important to dump the stuff we couldn't do well in order to focus on what we could do well. And it turned out to be a very good strategy. And again, had I, really made this more of a discipline and read the business books, I might have had less stumbling and tripping at that point. And may I point out the value of books. But I did get there, and that was really valuable. And I looked around. The other thing that I could do at Holy Names was I could make strategic alliances with agencies that could provide things for me that were not necessarily based in cash, but in an exchange of services. And one of those things, this was, again, when the library is open, the indexes and journals that nobody was using. And with the help of campus services, we ripped them out. And that became an art gallery and still is. We now have our 8th artist in residence. We had a wonderful reception last week. And for this reception, a faculty member who gave the talk, and that is her artwork, it's quite beautiful, thanked the library for honoring faculty achievements, which again was something very significant to us. And there was probably more people in the library that evening that had been in, the entire previous summer. And that was a terrific event. The other thing is, because we hadn't cataloged so many books, it made it extremely easy to weed reference. And this was the area that I looked at and I said, we've got an awful lot of, we don't have enough study space, and I know students like study space. So we started ripping out shelving. And I made another wonderful discovery. The wonderful discovery was that 40% of the shelving in this university, on the main floor, in this university which was 13 feet from the Hayward Fault, okay, earthquake zone, you know about that, you saw a little film this morning, drop and freak out or something like that. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm referring to how I behave in an earthquake. 40% of the shelving was unbolted and unbraced, 8-foot-high shelving all through the main floor, loaded with books. And we did, in fact, have a couple of small earthquakes last year, and I did exactly what you shouldn't do normally, which is run out of the library, because I didn't want to be killed. But when I discovered that, I realized that all that, because the other shelving was bolted in, and because the tiling is asbestos, that would be difficult to remove. But I had an excuse and an opportunity here to do more significant weeding, to do things like make an argument for why the print journals had to go. And in fact, it was an argument I only had with myself, because nobody on campus, I know that some of you, that print journals can be a huge disputation point, but for us, that ship sailed. We have a fairly strong electronic collection, which is something that, again, that I inherited, that we've grown and built and is increased in budget every year, and they vastly prefer it. So we opened up this space, and Robert Kift at Occidental in College in California has talked about sometimes the best thing you can do is open up a space and then let the possibilities happen. Just create that space, that kind of free space to let the mind go. And what we did was turned it into an event space. So this is students at an event. And again, look how packed that room is. And they're having a very good time. The music department saw the space and gave us a grand piano, so we have piano recitals in the library, which people love, lunchtime recitals, bring your lunch and eat in the library, and again, encouraging people to eat in the library. I know that's not new anymore, but for us it was revelatory. We started a book talk series, and it's actually known on campus. We call it the Cushing Salon series. And we now, a mailer just went out to 90,000 people in the Oakland Hills talking about our events. And this is Bella Cipriani, who's a blind author who is also, with funding from the university, after this event, he was asked to be our first writer in residence. And if you remember that room that was full of books, we had an education student paint a mural in it. We cleaned it out. We cataloged those books using volunteers from the library school. And actually that table's not in there anymore. It's a desk, and it's Bella's writer in residence office. So those things happened. And I'm not pretending that this is the grand library vision of the future for us. These are our interim steps. This is what we're doing to make the library a possibility in people's minds. But we got the campus services supported us in, we found some old, they're not beautiful, but the students actually like them, these enormous desks. I bought lamps from a hotel supply store because I wanted the plugs at desk level, and we immediately got a post on our blog thanking us. And by the way, Meredith's right about only start a blog if you can maintain it, and we've been posting to that blog once a week, every week for almost 3 years now. We call it the Hawk Squawk. The hawk is our mascot. The other name that staff had was Hey Zeus, and I said they couldn't do that one. Little joke, holy names. But those are the things we could do. And the other thing we could do is improve our digital presence. So we really didn't even have a website, But for relatively little money, and again, that print serials budget was the fountain of many things, including staff development and many, many brownies and cookies for events and wine and cheese and so forth. It's a lovely discovery layer on top of our clunky old ILS, which our users love. And again, we call it self-service interlibrary loan. They can click and get the books they want, and they're thrilled by that. The other thing I was encouraged and allowed to do was to restructure all the positions and bring in good staff. And this is our first real reference research skills librarian, and we intentionally hired somebody who was a skilled optimist. We were looking for those characteristics. I might not have called it that at the time, but even looking back at the interview questions, that's what we were looking for. And he was so good that we were given another slot at a time when many people are being cut the next year. Not the first year when I asked for it, but the next year we were given an additional position. Just like I've been asking for 3 years for additional student funding, this year our student funding was almost tripled. The first 2 years I kept making the argument, and the important thing was I just kept the smile on my face and kept asking and kept justifying it. I said, and I worked with student government and said, we can get, we want more hours. I said, well, don't tell me we want more hours. Go to the president and tell him you want more hours, because student labor is what opens the library. And I was told by some of my peers that we were too small to start a liaison librarian program. We couldn't possibly manage that with our team. And this is what they wanted to do, and it's actually amazing. I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't do this, but they actually give their faculty, when you only have 60 regular faculty, you can do things like this pretty easily. I'm sure if they were at Harvard and there was just 3 of them, it wouldn't be possible, but they do a fantastic job. So what are some of the outcomes? I know people say don't focus on numbers. Well, I love numbers. I love numbers when they go up like this. This is the circulation from 2001 to 2011. And that's our circ stats started to really go up. I need to put this in context. That's our circ stats from the last 15 or so years. So the reality is we will never be with circulation where we were in the 1990s, and the interesting thing though is I wasn't trying to raise our circulation statistics. We implemented a policy that instead of buying books that we thought people would want to use, that we would put most of our money into buying books that the faculty would request. And we let the faculty know that. You let us know what we want and we'll buy it. That's our policy, and it's still in place. And we do a little predictive purchasing, and we do for popular reading and so forth, which has become very popular. But for the most part, we do what we call faculty select, which is they're allowed to pick out the books. And that ensures that the book will have at least one circulation, right? But now, I'm going to show you the slide that my staff says looks like I made it up. This is what happened with our electronic resources. So we had we were able to push book circulation back up a little bit, which is pretty impressive for an academic library. But what we were really able to do was get people using our electronic resources, even though what we focused on was making the facility more welcome. So, which is one of the most interesting paradoxes in librarianship, is you create a beautiful space and people extend that space into the digital world. And of course, we focused on our digital space too, but I believe that it was our extravagant welcome, our focus on radical hospitality, and our very intentional decision-making that resulted in this. So, okay, all right, just checking on my time. And if you remember where the card catalogs were, the English department funded a writing center. So we have the writing studio in the library, and the education department saw that, and they funded the education curriculum center on the other side of the library. And it's all beautiful KI furniture, and it's, of course, become a magnet for the students. And we've also paid very close attention to what our faculty and students ask for. And again, part of optimism is saying, well, I'm going to ask them what they want, give them some great choices, and it doesn't matter if we can't afford it right now. What we need to know is what exactly they are looking for. And in fact, the thing they looked at, believe it or not, what they wanted most of all was WorldCat Local. It's not how we described it. We said, did they want a single interface for finding books and articles? But students being students, of course, comfy chairs are very important. And the cafe, we don't have a cafe, but they're welcome to bring food in. And now that we're doing a library architecture program, you can bet the cafe is the first thing out of their mouths every time we hold a meeting. And incidentally, the university, after I said for 3 years, we need a facility assessment, out of the blue, they had money at the end of the year and they funded a facility assessment, which was terrific. And this fall, we're funding a library architectural program, so we'll have a master plan, which again, part of optimism is, I think project management is essential to optimism. I think really you need to be able to plan and structure your future. We actually, every quarter, we each come up with a project plan and we share it, and then every 2 weeks, every other staff meeting, we share where we are. And it's okay if we haven't made progress in some areas or we're stalled. It's actually what we've discussed as a team is what it feels like to see progress on things, sometimes things that you don't believe you're going to make progress on. And of course, things fall from the sky or new things come up. But this was a Post-it survey we did for students of what they wanted. The Post-it survey was, these were enormous Post-its. Have you ever seen them? They're really big. We hung them around the library. And we put them, and we wrote on them, tell us what you want. Got that idea, by the way, from another university. And one of the first things I did when I started there was go around and have smart talks with other area library directors and begin a program of visiting libraries that were aspirational libraries for us, and picked up a lot of ideas. Notice how tiny that sliver is for books. It's there, but it's very small. So when we asked the students what they want and gave them a free rein, what they mostly want is bandwidth, more hours, and comfortable places to sit, which is a very interesting implications for the direction of our library, and certainly justifies where I'm thinking the library as a facility will go in terms of freeing up the space, because 6% of our collection drives 100% of our circulation. And at $325 per square foot, it's a waste of space to have things sitting in a facility that can be retrieved within 1 or 2 days from a nearby repository. And it's simply, again, it's repeating that over and over and over as part of the strategy of optimism. You know, after a while, the faculty begin repeating it back to me. So optimism requires vigilance and persistence and learned tactics. I mentioned that, and I emphasized Marty Seligman's book. And it also requires an awareness of your weaknesses and of your strengths. And it's also good to have a role model. Now, you might think that Joan of Arc is kind of a problematic role model. I know she ran into problems, but she was passionate, she was focused, and she knew how to articulate a vision. So that was really important. It's also important to recognize the heroes. And my whole team are heroes. They're an amazing group. I mean, they're extraordinary. And I got to build them from scratch, which is a rare opportunity. Think of, you know, if you have if you need to have a critical mass of that type of people in your library. If you don't, you'll be beating your head on a wall. That's just it. So recognize your heroes and remind them of their heroism. As I mentioned before, I schedule my negative time. I also, my associate director and I have a rule that we can say anything before 8 a.m. about people. I'm in very early. Take advantage of the fact that you can do what I call a controlled burn. If you're in a difficult situation, this is a great time to get rid of the microfilm collection if you don't think, you know, whatever it is you need to stop doing that's hard to stop doing, you now have a prime opportunity for doing it. And that's, you know, finding that silver lining in adversity. And there was a great, who was it who talked about play? Oh, we have had so much fun with the library as we've gone along, especially with our print journals. We made a Christmas tree, and actually, And even my boss, the vice president for academic affairs, came over and was pushing a book truck of old print journals. She said, "What are you doing with these afterwards?" And I said, "Don't ask." But, again, I talked about the long, hard slog. And we all have our walls that we need to get over. And there's strategies for getting over those walls of pessimism. Trust me, there's been times. There was one point a year in where there had been this big planning document put out that there had been much anticipation for a year called Next Steps. So Next Steps is offered to the whole Holy Names community, and there was not one word mentioned in this 42-page document about the library. That was a low moment for me. So I went home, I had my little temper tantrum at home, and I came in the next day, and the president had put out a message, "Does anybody have anything they'd like to say about the document?" So I wrote him, and what I did was I apologized. I said, I really fault myself for not being as articulate as I could have been about the need for the library's needs. And let me spell out some of the things that I think are important in the next steps of the university, and let me spell out why. And I cited, for example, the article that says that the library is the second most important institution when faculty and students are making a decision on campus. That they walk into the library, and that often influences admissions and hiring decisions right there. And what do you know? But the article was revised, and we're in there now. And he quoted that article in his inaugural address, which was almost a year after he came on board, but he was a busy fellow. So, but basically, to get there, what I had to do were some tactics called disputation, disruption, and distancing. I am a natural catastrophizer. I was repeatedly asked, "Do you have audio and video in your presentation?" "No way, are you kidding? It'll never work." That's actually, from doing a lot of presentations, that's probably not a bad thing. But we talk about when you don't practice the art of disruption and distancing and disputation. So the Apple Mouse story. So we put out these beautiful new iMacs. We were planning to roll out these iMacs into that area that you saw that became a gallery, and shiny new machines. For 2 staff meetings, we worried about what if the users steal the mice? Should we glue them in position? Oh, what then? What will we do? Steal the mice, da-da-da. Oh my goodness. And, I was the one leading this, conversation. And after 2 meetings, I said, "You know what? How about we just buy more mice?" I know, but, again, I was catastrophizing over something. Here I am with a library on the Hayward Fault with, these 8-foot bookcases packed with books, and I'm worrying about Apple mice being stolen. And in fact, a year later, it turned out the users so disliked these mice that we were wanting to actually hoping they would steal them. And to this day, not one has gone missing, but we replaced them with Kensington mice, and they're still there, so there you go. So that is, I needed to disrupt myself to get away from the negative thinking and ask myself, what really is going to happen? So, and you need to challenge the negative thoughts. You need to openly fight with them. Marty Seligman talks about that. You need to confront them, write them down, find out what the real issue is. And you'll often find out that they dwindle. It's like shining a flashlight in a corner. That huge monster turns out to be a squeaking mouse. Pollyanna reasoned her way through many a situation. She was actually quite strategic. I don't know, do you read Pollyanna in New Zealand? I don't know. Yeah, okay, and if you read it, it's just like Marion the Librarian was actually very much about free speech, even though she's often not portrayed that way. Pollyanna was strategically reasoning her way through many negative situations. There's this huge true catastrophe where she gets injured after an accident and she survives. And she was very good at disputation. And another strategy when things get low is look around and ask yourself, is there a policy that you really hate that you can repeal? Nothing feels better than getting rid of a policy you don't like, that isn't serving any purpose. And the staff will cheer, and it's just that is actually a great thing to do. The other thing you can do is start reframing the question. This is a study that was shown to demonstrate that librarians are, out of a list of 17 things that students will do when they need to answer a research question is a librarian is the 17th resource they'll go to. I mean, they would rather go to their parents than consult a librarian. But you can either look at that as depressing, or you can say, you know what? This shows that we need to have a better working relationship with faculty, because students do talk to faculty. And in fact, we actually, embedding our information literacy into the classroom with the cooperation of the faculty, who love it, in fact, we are aware that what we're actually doing in many cases is teaching the faculty what our resources are. But being faculty, we don't put it that way. We are, of course, teaching the students. So it comes down to looking at something from a different angle and seeing the opportunity. The other thing, how many of you have done a SWOT analysis? Oh, a few hands. I hate SWOT analysis. You know why? Because they're in the wrong order. I actually redo them as TOWs. Because as a writer, I know you should always end on an upbeat note. And if you do an analysis where the last thing you look at is your threats, you are going to end in a negative way. You look at it, you start with your threats, move through your opportunities, your weaknesses, and your strengths, which you'll often find are 4 things that are the same. And you end on an upbeat note. You've made the same analysis, but you leave the room feeling much better. 2 minutes? Okay. And you cannot over-communicate. You have to share your vision, your strategy, your expectations over and over and over again. Again, as with the information literacy and the faculty, you're talking to yourself as much as you're talking to other people, but I have found that to be important. And you need to give people a little time to acclimate to good ideas. I'm going to skim ahead just a little bit. And give yourself a place where failure is safe. I brew beer. A lot of it is undrinkable. And beat on problems with a stick. As I've mentioned, be persistent, keep asking for money, and also figure out how you're going to deliver bad information. This is Costco, which is a big warehouse, and you can actually purchase a casket from them, but they only sell to 34 states. But when you're delivering information like that, you should point out that, however, they do offer both expedited and regular delivery. Which, you know, I know when I think about it, I think I'll just put that funeral off another week and get the, save on the delivery costs. Give yourself plenty of reflective time, and be sure to get up off the dance floor and onto the balcony, to use a famous expression from leadership. Get up, go up on there and see the situation from the mile-high view. Hire optimists, teach and study optimism, grapple with your internal dialogues, analyze your explanatory style, and make space for good ideas. And I'd like to put in, with my last 30 seconds, there's been some great leadership this week from Maureen Sullivan, the president of the American Library Association. Earlier in this conference, one of the innovations I did was introduce overdrive books. And now I'm in the position of, explaining why I can't buy certain books for people's tablets when they love them so much, or why that book is $80 through Overdrive when it's $10 from Baker and Taylor. That there's been some tremendous leadership in the profession where Maureen Sullivan has basically asked people, with respect to ebooks, which side are you on? I don't know what her next step is, because she hasn't, and I'm sure she has one, but she's really showing some tremendous leadership, very optimistic leadership, not saying, oh, let's not worry about ebooks, we'll worry about our spaces, let's not do this, let's not do that. She's saying, yes, this is a solvable problem, and the first thing I want to know is, are you my ally in this? It's tremendous. And I'd like to point out, we are all familiar with the 5 laws of library science, but I have an apocryphal Rule 6, and it is really important, and I think it's important to optimism and into everything else, and that is, but the greatest of these is love. You have to love what you're doing. You have to fight for it. You have to breathe it. You have to be bold. You have to embrace it. You have to run with it. You have to be disciplined and strategic and tell yourself these things and set up your internal rules. And if you do that, you will have done the best thing you could have done for librarianship. So, oops, sorry. That's certainly... close that presentation. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you for staying and listening, and thank you for an amazing conference that was almost like a musical. And may you have great journeys ahead of you.
Sweet. Okay, we've got time for about 4 minutes worth of questions. Who wants to go first? No questions? All right. Thank you so much, Karen. Oh, we've got questions? Oh, we've got them down here.
You said when you were employing staff that you deliberately looked for skilled optimists. Did you mean, I took that to mean that you were looking for people who were skilled at optimism, or you may have meant that they were just skilled and optimistic.
You know, I think both things are the case. And I can't say, again, I didn't have it on the list, checklist, you know, skilled optimist, but we were looking for attitudes and approaches to problem solving that indicated that they wouldn't stumble. If they encountered problems, that they would seek problem solving and stay, and in general, stay upbeat. Does that make sense?